The snowstorm had come earlier than forecasted, fierce and unrelenting. The small town of Haverford, nestled deep in a valley surrounded by thick woods, was no stranger to harsh winters. But this storm was different. Its intensity seemed almost unnatural, a wall of white that swallowed the world beyond a few feet. By the time night fell, every street was buried, every sound muffled, and every soul trapped inside their homes. Almost every soul. Jonah Caldwell, a seasoned ranger, was on duty when the storm hit. The radio at the ranger station crackled with reports of a hiker stranded somewhere near Wolf Pine Trail. Against better judgment and with a stubborn sense of duty, Jonah geared up and ventured into the blizzard. His snowmobile groaned against the deep drifts, headlights barely cutting through the swirling frost. The wind screamed in his ears, an endless howl that seemed to carry whispers, faint and sinister. After an hour of trudging through the storm, he reached the trailhead. The path was barely visible, but he caught sight of footprints leading into the woods. They were uneven, erratic, as if the person had been staggering or running. Jonah called out, his voice instantly smothered by the wind. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became, as if the storm was holding its breath. The tracks led to an abandoned cabin, its sagging roof and broken windows hidden beneath a heavy blanket of snow. Jonah's flashlight swept across the door, which hung ajar, creaking softly. Inside, the air was still and cold enough to bite at exposed skin. "Hello?" he called again, stepping into the darkness. The cabin was empty, at least at first glance. There was no sign of a fire, no belongings, nothing to suggest anyone had been there recently. Yet the tracks outside said otherwise. Jonah's flashlight flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw something move in the corner, a shadow within a shadow. But when he turned, there was nothing. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He stepped back toward the door, but a faint sound stopped him. It was a voice, low and broken, whispering his name. "Jonah?" His breath hitched. "Who's there?" he demanded, turning in every direction. The whisper came again, closer this time, dragging his name like a rusted nail across glass. Then he saw it, a figure at the far end of the room, pale and gaunt, with eyes like pits of black ice. It wore the face of a man Jonah had once known, a hiker who'd gone missing last winter and had never been found. But the thing in front of him wasn't human. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide as it let out a guttural, inhuman screech that echoed in Jonah's skull. He bolted, stumbling into the storm. The snow felt heavier, clinging to him like hands trying to pull him down. Behind him, he could hear it, moving fast, the crunch of snow and snapping of branches. His flashlight beam danced wildly, catching fleeting glimpses of something long-limbed and wrong, its body contorted in ways that defied nature. Jonah ran until his legs burned, and his lungs screamed for air. The storm pressed down on him, disorienting and blinding. He tripped, falling into a deep snowbank, and lay there, too exhausted to move. For a moment, all was silent. Then it came again, that voice, rasping his name in a tone that sent ice through his veins. He turned, and there it was, inches away. Its breath was a cloud of frost, its eyes unblinking voids. Jonah screamed, and everything went black. When the storm cleared the next morning, the search party found Jonah's snowmobile abandoned at the trailhead. His footprints led into the woods but vanished near the cabin. They found no sign of him, just the cabin standing empty and quiet, its door wide open. The only clue was Jonah's radio, discovered deep in the snow. It still worked, though the static was thick and warped. Sometimes, late at night, rangers swear they hear his voice through the interference, calling for help, his pleas swallowed by an endless howl of wind. Haverford locals say the woods have always been haunted and that the blizzards bring out the things that live in the dark. They say you should never follow footprints in the snow, no matter how desperate they seem, because you might find something waiting. Or worse, it might find you.
Story number 2.
The storm had begun in the late afternoon, heavy flakes falling like ashes from a cursed sky. By nightfall, the entire stretch of Highway 32 was impassable, a white wasteland of ice and snow. Amelia and her fiancé Tyler had no choice but to pull over when their car skidded dangerously close to the guardrail. They were miles from the nearest town, stranded with nothing but the dense forest surrounding them. "This is bad," Tyler muttered, shivering as he cranked the heater. Amelia stared into the darkness, the trees looming like jagged teeth on either side of the road. She tried her phone again, but there was no signal. "Let's just wait it out," she said, more to herself than to Tyler. "Someone will come." But hours passed and no one came. The heater sputtered and died, and the cold began to creep in, relentless and biting. Tyler rummaged through the trunk, finding a flashlight and an old blanket. "There's a gas station marked on the map," he said, pointing to a spot a few miles ahead. "We can make it if we walk." Amelia hesitated. The snow was still falling, the wind howling like a living thing. But the alternative, freezing in the car, was worse. Bundling up as best they could, they stepped into the night, the flashlight casting a feeble glow on the endless expanse of white. The first mile was uneventful, though the wind was deafening and the cold seeped through their layers. But as they trudged onward, Amelia began to notice things. Subtle at first, shapes moving in her peripheral vision, faint whispers carried on the wind. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tyler shook his head, focused on the path ahead. But then they both heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from the woods. They froze. The flashlight beam darted into the trees, revealing only darkness and the skeletal branches weighed down by snow. "Probably an animal," Tyler said, though he didn't sound convinced. They walked faster. The growling came again, louder, closer. This time it was joined by a sound that made Amelia's blood run cold. Laughter, high-pitched and hollow, like a child's giggle distorted by static. "Who's there?" Tyler shouted, spinning the flashlight wildly. The laughter stopped, leaving only the wind. But the sense of being watched was overwhelming, a weight pressing down on them from all sides. "We need to move," Amelia whispered, grabbing Tyler's arm. They broke into a run, their breaths clouding the air. The growls and laughter returned, now accompanied by footsteps crunching in the snow, more than one set. Amelia glanced back and screamed. Figures were emerging from the trees, pale and emaciated, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They moved unnaturally, jerking and twitching, their limbs too long, their faces stretched into grotesque grins. Tyler pulled her forward, his grip like iron. "Don't stop!" The figures gave chase, their movements impossibly fast. The flashlight flickered as Amelia and Tyler stumbled through the snow, the world narrowing to the sound of their own panicked breaths and the relentless crunch of footsteps behind them. The gas station appeared suddenly, a faint glow of light in the distance. They sprinted toward it, the creatures closing in, their distorted laughter echoing in the night. They burst through the door, slamming it shut behind them. Inside, the warmth was a shock, the fluorescent lights flickering above. An old man sat behind the counter, his expression unreadable. "You made it," he said flatly. Amelia and Tyler collapsed against the counter, gasping for air. "There's something out there," Tyler managed, his voice shaking. The old man nodded, as if this was nothing new. "They always come in the storm," he said. "Hungry things." Amelia stared at him in disbelief. "What are they?" "Call them whatever you like. Spirits, demons, shadows," the man said. "They're just death in a different shape." A loud bang on the door made them jump. The creatures were outside, their grinning faces pressed against the glass, fogging it with their breath. "You can't stay here," the man said, his voice eerily calm. "They don't leave witnesses." Before they could protest, the lights went out, plunging the gas station into darkness. The last thing Amelia saw was the old man smiling, his teeth sharp and wrong, as the creatures outside shattered the glass. The next morning, a plow cleared Highway 32, finding the couple's abandoned car buried in snow. There was no sign of Amelia or Tyler, only faint footprints leading into the forest. Locals whispered about the storm and the things it brought, but no one dared venture into the woods. The gas station, once a beacon of safety, stood empty and forgotten, its windows boarded up, its walls scrawled with desperate warnings. "Stay away."
Story number 3.
The blizzard was the worst anyone had seen in decades, a howling tempest that swallowed the tiny village of Gray Hollow in a suffocating blanket of snow. The few residents who lived there knew better than to go out after dark during such storms. The old stories, told in hushed voices around crackling fires, warned of things that walked in the snow at night, things that weren't human. But Maria had no choice. Her daughter, Lily, had spiked a fever earlier that day, and by nightfall her breathing was shallow, her skin pale and clammy. The village doctor lived 3 miles away, a trek that would be suicide in this weather. Maria bundled Lily in blankets and laid her gently on a sled, tying it securely before bracing herself against the storm. The wind cut like knives as she trudged forward, every step a battle. The world beyond her lantern was an endless expanse of white, the snow falling so thick it felt like walking through a dream or a nightmare. Half a mile in, she began to hear it. A faint melodic sound carried on the wind. It was almost like singing, though the words were impossible to make out. Maria stopped, her breath fogging the air. "Hello?" she called, though she immediately regretted it. The singing stopped, leaving only the deafening roar of the storm. She tightened her grip on the sled's rope and pressed on. The singing returned, closer this time, and now it was unmistakably human, or at least it sounded that way. A lilting, mournful tune that seemed to echo all around her. The hairs on the back of Maria's neck stood on end. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice barely carrying over the wind. A shadow moved in the storm, just at the edge of her lantern's light. Maria froze, her heart hammering. The figure was tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long, its face obscured by the swirling snow. "Please," she called out, her voice breaking. "My daughter is sick. I just need to get to the doctor." The figure tilted its head as if curious. Then it stepped closer. Maria's lantern illuminated a face that wasn't a face at all. The thing's skin was as white as the snow, its eyes pits that seemed to absorb the light. Its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, rows of jagged teeth glinting in the lantern's glow. Maria screamed, stumbling back. The sled jerked, and she turned to see another figure behind her, identical to the first. Then another and another, emerging from the storm like wraiths. They began to sing again, their voices weaving together in a haunting, wordless melody that seemed to pierce Maria's mind. She grabbed the sled's rope and ran, her boots sinking deep into the snow with every step. The figures followed, gliding effortlessly over the drifts, their song growing louder, more insistent. Maria dared not look back, even as the sled felt heavier and heavier, as if something unseen was pulling it down. When she finally reached the doctor's cabin, she was sobbing, her hands numb and bloodied from gripping the rope. She banged on the door until it flew open, the doctor's startled face appearing in the doorway. "They're coming!" Maria cried, dragging the sled inside. The doctor pulled her in and slammed the door, bolting it tight. "What are you talking about?" he asked, but his words trailed off as he looked down at the sled. It was empty. "No," Maria whispered, tearing at the blankets. Lily was gone. The sled was soaked with snow, but there was no sign of her daughter, not even footprints leading away. "They took her," Maria sobbed, collapsing to the floor. "They took her." The doctor tried to calm her as they snaked, but there was a look in his eyes, something more than pity. "You should never have gone out in the storm," he said quietly. "Not after dark." "What are they?" Maria asked, her voice raw. The doctor hesitated. "We call them the Frostborn," he said at last. "They come with the storms, looking for the lost, the desperate. They sing to lure you in, and once you see them—" He didn't finish the thought. Maria stayed in the cabin that night, unable to sleep. She sat by the window, staring into the endless snow, hoping against hope to see Lily's face. But all she saw were shadows moving in the storm, and all she heard was the faint, haunting melody of the Frostborn, singing her name. When the storm passed the next morning, the sled was found at the edge of the woods, empty except for a single strand of golden hair frozen into the ice.
Story number 4.
The town of Briarwood was dying. Once a thriving mining community, its population had dwindled over the years, leaving only a handful of stubborn residents clinging to their homes like the last leaves on a frozen tree. The surrounding forest, thick with ancient pines, had grown wild and untamed, encroaching on the few remaining buildings. In the dead of winter, when the snow piled high and the sun barely scraped the horizon, the woods seemed alive. People spoke of strange sounds at night, cracks and whispers that didn't belong to the wind. But for Eleanor, a widow who lived alone in the last house at the edge of the forest, it was easier to dismiss these stories as superstition than to think too deeply about them. Until the night she heard the knocking. It was just past midnight, the world outside cloaked in a blizzard that rattled her windows and howled through the trees. Eleanor had been dozing by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, when a sharp, deliberate knock echoed from the front door. She froze. No one ever came to her house, especially not in weather like this. Knock, knock. Eleanor hesitated, then stood, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the frosted window. The porch was empty, the snow untouched. Knock, knock. The sound was louder now, more insistent. Eleanor's breath hitched. It wasn't coming from the front door anymore. It was coming from the back. Her pulse quickened as she turned toward the kitchen. The back door was solid oak, bolted shut, and she could see through the small window in its center. Beyond it, the storm raged and the shadows of the forest swayed and shifted. Knock, knock. She took a shaky step toward the door, gripping the edge of the counter for support. "Who is it?" she demanded, her voice firmer this time. Still no answer. As she drew closer, she noticed something strange. The snow outside the door was undisturbed. No footprints, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. Yet the knocking persisted, relentless and unnatural. Her fingers hovered over the lock, but a gut-deep sense of dread held her back. The firelight behind her flickered, casting her shadow long and thin against the wall. Knock. Knock. The sound shifted again, this time to the window above the sink. Eleanor spun around, her eyes wide. She could see nothing but darkness beyond the glass, yet she felt something watching her, pressing against the thin barrier between them. The knock came again, and this time it was louder, as though whatever was out there was growing impatient. Eleanor backed away, her heart pounding. She grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace, clutching it tightly. "Go away," she shouted, her voice cracking. Silence. For a moment she thought it was over. The storm raged on, the house groaning in protest against the wind, but the knocking had stopped. She allowed herself a shaky breath. Then she heard it, a scraping sound like nails dragging across wood coming from above. Her blood ran cold, the roof. Eleanor's gaze darted the ceiling. The sound moved, slow and deliberate, as if something heavy was crawling across the shingles. She stumbled back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The scraping stopped, and then came the whisper, faint but clear, seeping through the walls like smoke. Eleanor. Her name, drawn out and distorted, sent shivers down her spine. She clutched the poker tighter, her knuckles white. Eleanor. The voice was closer now, just outside the window. She turned, the firelight casting erratic shadows across the walls. For a split second, she thought she saw something. A face pressed against the glass, pale and wrong, with hollow eyes and a wide, jagged grin. She screamed, stumbling backward. The poker clattered to the floor as the room seemed to close in around her. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices now, all calling her name, all promising things she didn't want to understand. The last thing she saw, before the firelight flickered out completely, was the back door creaking open, the snow beyond untouched, and the darkness inside swallowing everything. The next morning, a neighbor passing through on a snowmobile found Eleanor's house eerily quiet. The front door was ajar, the fire long dead. Inside, the furniture was untouched, the air cold and still. Eleanor was gone, her tracks leading into the woods. But they didn't stop there. Instead, they circled the house again and again, as if she'd been walking endlessly in the snow. And though the blizzard had erased all other signs, the faint sound of knocking could still be heard when the wind was just right.
Story number 5.
The village of Black Hollow was known for its brutal winters, but no one ever left. They said the cold there had a mind of its own. Generations had lived and died beneath its icy grasp, bound by a secret no one dared to speak aloud. When outsiders asked why no one moved away, the villagers would give polite smiles and vague answers, their eyes flicking nervously toward the woods. Martha and Greg, a couple from the city, thought it would be the perfect winter getaway. They rented a cozy cabin on the outskirts of the village, eager to escape the noise and chaos of urban life. The place was idyllic, surrounded by pristine snow-covered pines and far from the nearest neighbor. The villagers had been polite but distant when they arrived. "Stay inside after dark," the innkeeper had warned them as they picked up the cabin key. "It gets dangerous out there." "Wolves?" Greg had joked, but the innkeeper only shook her head, her expression grim. They didn't take the warning seriously. The first 2 nights were peaceful, filled with the crackle of the fireplace and the quiet beauty of the snowy landscape. But on the 3rd night, the temperature plummeted. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the cabin's windows and filling the air with an eerie, mournful wail. "I think we should start the fire early tonight," Martha said, pulling her sweater tight around her. Greg nodded, already stacking wood in the hearth. The storm outside was relentless, the snow piling high against the cabin walls. As they sat by the fire, sipping hot cocoa, there was a sound, a faint, distant knock. Greg frowned. "Did you hear that?" Martha paused, listening. The knock came again, louder this time, from the front door. "It's probably the wind," she said, though her voice wavered. Greg stood and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. The porch light illuminated only a swirl of snow and darkness. No one was there. Knock, knock. This time it came from the back door. Greg froze, his breath fogging the air. "It's probably just the wind," he said, echoing Martha's words, though they sounded hollow now. The knocking continued, moving from one window to the next, then to the walls as if something or someone was circling the cabin. Martha grabbed Greg's arm. "We should call someone." He pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. "The storm must have knocked out the tower," he muttered. The knocking grew more insistent, accompanied by a faint scratching sound like nails dragging across the wood. Then came a voice, soft and distant, barely audible over the wind. "Let us in." Martha's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" Greg nodded, his face pale. "It's probably just... It's not the wind," Martha snapped, cutting him off. The voice came again, closer now, its tone syrupy and wrong. "Please, it's so cold out here." Greg bolted the doors and pulled the curtains tight. "We're not opening the door," he said firmly, though his hands shook. The fire flickered, its light casting shifting shadows across the room. The knocking stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then came the laughter. It started soft, a single voice chuckling, but it grew, joined by others until it filled the cabin, echoing from every direction. It wasn't human laughter. It was high-pitched and hollow, like the cackle of something that had never known joy. The walls began to creak and groan as if the very cabin was alive, straining against the cold. The fire dimmed, its flames flickering weakly, and the temperature inside plummeted. "Greg," Martha whispered, her breath visible in the freezing air. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't keep us out," it said. The front door burst open, the storm roaring inside, carrying with it a figure cloaked in shadow. Its form was indistinct, shifting and rippling like smoke, but its eyes burned like embers. More figures followed, slithering and crawling through the snow, their movements unnatural and jerky. Martha screamed as the shadows filled the cabin, their icy grip pulling her and Greg into the freezing dark. The fire sputtered out, and the storm consumed everything. The next morning, when the villagers ventured to the cabin, they found it empty. The doors hung open, the interior coated in a thin layer of frost. There was no sign of Martha or Greg, only faint footprints in the snow leading into the woods. The innkeeper shook her head sadly. "The cold doesn't take kindly to outsiders," she said, and the villagers nodded in solemn agreement. From that day on, no one rented out the cabin again.
Story number 6.
The snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the desolate stretch of road in a suffocating white. Erin's hands gripped the wheel tightly as she squinted into the blinding storm. She was hours behind schedule, her cell phone dead and her GPS useless. Her heart sank as the car sputtered, the fuel gauge needle firmly on empty. When the engine finally gave out, Erin cursed under her breath clouding in the freezing air. She was stranded. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, a tunnel of snow-covered trees with no sign of life. Her only hope was the faint light she'd seen through the woods a mile back. It had been brief, like a flickering lantern, but it was better than freezing to death in her car. Pulling on her coat and gloves, Erin stepped into the storm. The snow was deep, swallowing her boots with each step, and the cold was brutal, biting through her layers. She pressed on, following the faint glow that seemed to pulse in the distance, always just out of reach. After what felt like hours, she came upon a clearing. In the center stood a small, crooked cabin, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. Relief flooded her as she stumbled to the door, her numb fingers fumbling with the handle. The door creaked open on its own. "Hello?" she called, stepping inside. The warmth was immediate, chasing the chill from her bones. The cabin's interior was cozy, almost too perfect, like something out of a storybook. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and a steaming pot of soup sat on the table. "Is anyone here?" Erin asked again, her voice trembling. No answer. She should have felt uneasy, but the warmth was intoxicating. She peeled off her soaked coat and boots, sinking into a chair by the fire. The aroma of the soup was irresistible, and before she knew it, she was ladling it into a bowl. As she ate, she noticed something strange. There were no personal items in the cabin, no photographs, no books, nothing to suggest someone lived there. Just the fire, the soup, and the glow of the lanterns. A soft knock at the door startled her. Erin froze, the spoon halfway to her mouth. She hadn't seen anyone else for miles. Who could possibly be out in this storm? The knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. No answer. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the small window. The porch was empty, the snow untouched. The knock came again, but this time it wasn't at the door. It came from behind her. She spun around, her heart racing. The cabin was empty. The The fire flickered, and for the first time, she noticed how cold the air had grown. The knock came again, this time from the window. Erin turned slowly, her breath hitching. Through the frosted glass, she saw a face. A pale, expressionless face with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. She stumbled back, her scream caught in her throat. The face disappeared, but the knocking continued, now coming from all sides as if the cabin was surrounded. The lights dimmed, the fire sputtering weakly. Shadows began to move across the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice whispered, low and guttural, seeming to echo from the very walls. Erin backed into a corner, clutching a fire poker she'd grabbed from the hearth. "Who's there?" she cried. The shadows coalesced, forming a tall, spindly figure that loomed over her. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and its grin widened impossibly. "This is our place," it hissed, its voice a chorus of whispers, "and you will stay." The last thing Erin saw was the shadows descending, smothering the firelight and plunging the cabin into darkness. When searchers finally found her car 3 days later, there was no sign of Erin. The cabin, too, was gone, as if it had never existed. All that remained in the clearing were her footprints, circling endlessly in the snow.
Story number 7.
The train to Glacier Summit was a marvel of engineering, winding its way through treacherous mountain passes blanketed in snow. For decades, it had been the lifeline for the isolated communities nestled in the peaks. But it was also infamous. Over the years, passengers had whispered stories of the phantom car, a ghostly anomaly that appeared only during the fiercest storms. Sarah, a travel blogger with a penchant for thrill-seeking, had heard the rumors but dismissed them as folklore. She had booked a ticket on the last train of the season, eager to capture the stunning winter landscapes and the eerie beauty of the mountains at night. The first part of the journey was uneventful. Sarah chatted with a few fellow passengers, sipped coffee in the dining car, and snapped pictures of the snow-laden forests. As darkness fell, the storm began. By the time the train reached the higher elevations, the wind howled like a beast, slamming against the windows and shaking the car. Sarah's companions had retreated to their berths, but she stayed awake, fascinated by the storm's raw power. It was near midnight when the train lurched violently, throwing her from her seat. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging the car into darkness. "Just the storm," she muttered, trying to reassure herself. She fumbled for her phone and dialed, using its flashlight to navigate. As she made her way toward the door, she noticed something strange. The car was completely empty. The dining tables were still set, half-finished drinks and plates of food left behind, but the passengers were gone. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" No answer. She pushed through the door into the next car, but it was the same. Empty seats, abandoned belongings, no sign of life. Panic began to set in. She knew she wasn't alone when the lights went out. Sarah's phone buzzed in her hand, startling her. A message appeared on the screen, though she had no service. "You're not supposed to be here." Her heart raced as she looked around, half expecting to see someone standing behind her. The car was silent, save for the wind howling outside. The train jolted again, and Sarah stumbled, her phone slipping from her grasp and skittering under a seat. As she bent to retrieve it, she saw a pair of feet on the other side of the aisle. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The feet didn't move. She straightened slowly, her flashlight shaking as she raised it to illuminate the figure. It was a man, or what looked like one. His skin was ashen, his eyes sunken and dark, and his mouth twisted into a slack, unnatural grin. His clothes were old-fashioned, tattered and dusted with frost. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and hollow. Sarah backed away, but the man didn't follow. Instead, he simply vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. Her breathing quickened as she ran to the next car, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Each car was the same, empty, abandoned, and freezing cold. The storm outside was so intense now that she could barely see through the windows, the snow swirling like a living thing. She reached the rear car, where the exit door was ajar, snow drifting inside. Beyond it, the tracks disappeared into darkness. The train shuddered to a stop. The sudden stillness was oppressive, the only sound the faint whistle of the wind. Sarah hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay inside. But then she saw it, a faint glow coming from the woods beyond the tracks, like a lantern swaying in the storm. Compelled by some inexplicable force, she stepped off the train. The snow was impossibly deep, but she trudged toward the light, her flashlight barely piercing the darkness. The glow grew brighter as she approached, revealing a figure holding an old, rusted lantern. It was the man from the train. "Come with me," he said, his grin widening. Sarah tried to turn back, but her feet wouldn't move. The snow seemed to pull at her, dragging her closer to the figure. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "But now, you'll never leave." The last thing Sarah saw was the light of the lantern as it engulfed her, swallowing her scream in the storm. When the train reached Glacier Summit the next morning, Sarah's seat was empty, her luggage untouched. The conductor swore he'd seen her board, but no one else remembered her. In the years that followed, passengers continued to report strange sightings during storms. An empty car, a flickering lantern, and a figure with a terrible grin. The stories all ended the same. Once you boarded the Phantom car, you never got off.
Story number 8.
The small mountain town of Eversnow was known for its brutal winters. Snowstorms could last for weeks, and the roads would often vanish under thick drifts. The locals had long since learned to prepare for these storms, but nothing could prepare them for the night the snow began to whisper. It started during a blizzard, the worst the town had seen in decades. Trina, a college student home for the holidays, sat alone in her parents' old farmhouse. Her parents were away visiting relatives, leaving her to care for the family's elderly dog, Max. The house was quiet except for the wind outside, which howled like a living thing. Wrapped in a blanket, Trina tried to focus on her book, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was Max who noticed it first. The old dog perked up, his ears swiveling toward the window. A low growl rumbled in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Trina asked, setting the book aside. Max didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the window, his growl growing louder. Trina got up and peered outside. The world was a blur of white, the snow falling so thickly that she couldn't see more than a few feet. And then she heard it, a faint, eerie whisper carried on the wind. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but as she strained to listen, the whisper grew louder, forming words. Trina. Her blood ran cold. She stepped back from the window, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. The whisper came again, this time from the back door. "Trina, let us in." Max barked, a sharp, panicked sound that made Trina jump. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell tower. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, circling the house. It sounded like multiple voices now, overlapping and discordant. "Trina, it's cold. Let us in." She bolted the doors and pulled the curtains tight, her hands trembling. The whispers didn't stop. They surrounded the house, pressing against the walls, the windows, the very air. Max barked again, then whimpered, backing away from the front door. The whispering ceased abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. And then came the knock. A soft, deliberate knock at the door. "Who's there?" Trina demanded, clutching a kitchen knife. No answer. She approached the door slowly, her heart pounding. Through the peephole, she saw nothing but swirling snow. The knock came again, louder this time. "Go away!" she shouted, her voice cracking. Silence. And then a child's voice, soft and pleading. "Please, I'm lost. Let me in." Trina hesitated. She knew the storm was deadly, and the thought of a child out there alone was unbearable. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her hand hovering over the lock. "Please," the voice whimpered. "It's so cold." Something about the voice was wrong. Too hollow, too perfect. Max growled again, his fur bristling, and Trina froze. The dog had never acted this way before. "No," she whispered to herself, stepping back from the door. The child's voice changed, twisting into a low, guttural snarl. "Let us in, Trina." The door shook violently, as if something massive was pounding against it. The walls trembled, the windows rattling in their frames. Trina grabbed Max and fled upstairs, barricading herself in her bedroom. The pounding continued, accompanied by laughter. Horrible, inhuman laughter that seemed to come from everywhere. "Trina, you can't hide forever." The whispers seeped through the walls, the floor, the very air. The room grew colder and colder, frost creeping across the windows and walls. And then, silence. Trina sat huddled in the corner, clutching Max, her breath visible in the freezing air. She waited, the minutes stretching into hours. Finally, she dared to move. She crept to the window and peeked outside. The storm had passed, leaving the world eerily still. But the snow outside wasn't pristine. It was covered in footprints, hundreds of them, circling the house and leading away into the woods. She never saw what had come for her that night, but she knew one thing. She would never spend another winter alone in Eversnow.
Story number 9.
The logging camp of Frosthaven was nestled deep in the remote northern wilderness. cut off from the world every winter by snowdrifts that reached the rooftops. The men who stayed behind during the cold months did so out of necessity. Someone had to watch over the equipment, maintain the cabins, and keep the logging roads clear. This year, it was Jack, Mateo, and Carl who stayed behind. They weren't friends, just men with nowhere else to go. The three of them kept mostly to themselves, passing the long nights with card games and whiskey. It was on the night of the first full moon that the snow started to fall differently. Jack noticed it first, staring out the window of the common cabin. "Hey, you ever seen snow fall in circles?" he asked, his voice uneasy. Carl scoffed, setting down his mug. "What are you talking about?" "Come here," Jack insisted. The three men crowded by the frosted window. Outside, the snow wasn't falling straight. It was swirling in perfect concentric circles, as if caught in some invisible dance. "That's just the wind," Mateo said, though he didn't sound convinced. Jack shook his head. "Wind doesn't move like that." The storm grew worse as the night wore on. The snow fell faster, the wind howling with an almost human pitch. The men locked the doors, threw more wood on the fire, and tried to ignore the strange patterns outside. But the unease grew. Around midnight, the sound began. It was faint at first, like the distant tinkling of ice breaking. Then it grew louder until it became a rhythmic scraping noise, as if something sharp was being dragged across the walls. "What the hell is that?" Carl muttered, grabbing his flashlight. Jack and Mateo followed him to the door, their breaths visible in the freezing air. They hesitated, but Carl was too stubborn to stay inside. "I'm checking it out," he said, pulling on his coat and boots. "You're an idiot," Jack said, but he didn't try to stop him. Carl stepped out into the blizzard, his flashlight cutting weakly through the swirling snow. He turned the beam toward the wall of the cabin and froze. Scratched into the wood in long, jagged marks were words. "We see you." Carl stumbled back, shouting for the others. Jack and Mateo rushed outside, their faces pale as they read the message. "Who would have done this?" Jack asked, his voice tight. "We're the only ones out here." Mateo shined his flashlight around, but the snow was undisturbed. No tracks, no sign of anyone. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, echoing through the trees. "It's coming from the forest," Mateo said, his voice barely a whisper. They turned toward the tree line where the darkness seemed to ripple and shift. Something was moving out there, just beyond the reach of their lights. "Get inside," Jack said, his voice shaking. They slammed the door and bolted it, their breath coming fast. The scratching noise continued, circling the cabin, now accompanied by a soft, high-pitched giggle. "That's not human," Mateo said, clutching the axe he'd grabbed from the woodpile. The giggling turned into a chorus, overlapping voices rising and falling in a twisted, mocking harmony. Jack grabbed the radio, desperate for help, but all he got was static. Then over the static, a voice, "It's too late." The fire in the hearth flickered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. The laughter stopped, replaced by silence so deep it seemed to press against their ears. A single knock came at the door. Then another. And another, growing faster and louder until it sounded like dozens of fists pounding in unison. Mateo screamed, swinging the axe wildly as the door splintered. Shadows poured in, impossibly long and thin, twisting and writhing like smoke. Jack grabbed a lantern, lighting it with trembling hands. The faint glow revealed the shadows' true forms, tall, gaunt figures with faces like cracked porcelain and eyes that burned with cold blue fire. One of them spoke, its voice echoing like wind through a hollow cave. "You stayed too long. Now you belong to us." The shadows surged forward, engulfing the men in a freezing embrace. Their screams were cut short, had swallowed by the dark. When the snow finally stopped and a rescue party arrived weeks later, the camp was empty. The cabins were intact, but there were no footprints, no bodies, only the words scratched into the walls of every building. "We see you."